Hey book friends, it's Sarah from the GSMC Book Review Podcast. As the weather gets chillier, maybe you're thinking of getting a new comforter or a new quilt to wrap up in on cold autumn and coming winter days to snuggle under and read a book with. Well, I have got just the deal for you. If you are looking for new bedding, for a down alternative reversible comforter, for a really fun quilt, anything bedding with classic colors, you should go to linensandhutch.com. Right now, if you use the promo code GSMCBOOK, when you check out, you will receive 70% off their entire website, as well as free shipping. Yes, you heard me right, 70% off. They have cut out the middle person. They work directly with designers and manufacturers, which means they can pass the savings directly on to you. So if you're looking for new bedding, especially the cozy quilt or blankie to wrap up in while you read a good book, go to linensandhutch.com and use the promo code GSMCBOOK during checkout. You will receive 70% off and free shipping on their entire website.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and happy to be with you as I continue to work on catching up on interviews and posting them, because I have amazing authors that talk to me on this podcast and I want to share them with you. And so I am working very hard to get back on track after a crazy couple of months. If you listened to the last episode, then you know today I am speaking with author Edward Willett. This is his second appearance on the podcast to talk about his Worldshapers series. The first time he was here, we talked about the first two books, and now book 3 is out. If you are interested in listening to that other episode before you listen to this one, if you haven't heard it already, that is episode 193. Again, interview with Edward Willett. That was almost exactly a year ago. It was November 1st last year. So really fun to have Edward back on the podcast. Let me go ahead and read you the description of the Moonlit World, which is book 3 of the Worldshapers series. Fresh from their adventures in a world inspired by Jules Verne, Shauna Keyes and Carl Yatzer find themselves in a world that mirrors much darker tales. Beneath a full moon that hangs motionless in the sky, they're forced to flee terrifying vampiric creatures, only to run straight into a pack of werewolves. As the lycanthropes and undead battle, Carl is spirited away to the castle of the vampire queen. Meanwhile, Shauna finds short-lived refuge in a fortified village, where she learns that something has gone horribly wrong with the world in which she finds herself. Once, werewolves, vampires, and humans lived there harmoniously. Now every group is set against every other, and entire villages are being mysteriously emptied of people. Somehow, Carl and Shauna must reunite, discover the mysteries of the shaping of this strange world, and escape it for the next, without being sucked dry, devoured, or worst of all, turned into creatures of the night themselves. Beneath the frozen gibbous moon, allies, enemies, surprises, adventures, and unsettling revelations await. Again, that is the description of the Moonlit World by Edward Willett. It is the third in his Worldshapers series. Now, if you are unfamiliar with this series, Edward's going to talk about it here in a few minutes, but there are the two characters that are mentioned, Shauna Keyes and Carl Yatzer, are traveling through different worlds on a quest, and each world is shaped by a different shaper, so they can take on, they may look a lot like our Earth, or they may look very, very different. As it said in the description, the last world they were on was shaped by a shaper who was a fan of Jules Verne, and so there's a lot of steampunk, and there was a lot of different aspects of Jules Verne in that. And here, obviously, we have vampires and werewolves, but the shapers, the shaper who makes each world can put their own spin on things. So they may have traditional vampire and werewolf lore, or they may not. So there are so many possibilities in these stories that Edward writes, because they're based in some things that we might be familiar with in terms of literature or popular culture or things like that, but they can take a different direction because the shaper can create whatever he or she wants in each world. Speaking of pop culture, these books are littered with references to pop culture. They remind me that I am a bit of a nerd because I get most of them. The ones that I don't get, I'm like, well, okay, I'm not as big of a nerd as I thought I might be. Or maybe I'm not as big of a nerd as Edward. Sorry, Edward, I mean that as a compliment. But so many pop culture references, and they tend to make me laugh out loud. Really, you know that I laugh out loud a lot when I'm reading books, much to my husband's dismay. So let's go ahead and turn now to the interview with Edward Willett. Again, the series is Worldshapers. This is book 3, and it's called The Moonlit World.
Hi, Edward. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am excited to have you back. As I was saying before we started recording, it has been almost exactly a year since you were on the podcast last, so that is exciting. We're here to talk about your new book in your Worldshapers series. That one's called The Moonlit World. But before we get to that book and the series, if you could start, just for people who might not have heard the previous interview, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Well, I automatically click into my almost memorized bio at this point. I'm the award-winning author of more than 60 books of science fiction, fantasy, and nonfiction for readers of all ages. My nonfiction is run, I'm a full-time freelance writer and have been since 1993, so nonfiction is basically anything anybody will pay me to write. I've done a lot of children's biographies and science books for educational publishers, genetics demystified from McGraw-Hill, that kind of thing, local history. But on the fiction side, I've lost track, but it's around 20 novels. With my major publisher is Daw Books, one of the major science fiction fantasy publishers in New York. And the current one, The Moonlit World, is my 11th for them, I believe. Or is it my 12th? I'm terrible at this. And I live in Regina.
You list.
I do. I live in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. I'm also a professional actor and singer. I've done a fair amount of stage work over the years. Married to past president of the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Saskatchewan, and have a university-age daughter and a black Siberian cat named Shadowpaw. I think that covers it.
I think so. And Shadowpaw actually has her, I'm not sure, own social media presence, a little bit.
Well, he does a bit, and he's also, I have a publishing company, too, a little publishing company I started called Shadowpaw Press, which is named after him. He has a publishing history. He was actually my publisher. Daw Books has Betsy Wollheim and Sheila Gilbert are the editors and the publishers. They own the company. And Betsy owns his uncle Roscoe and knew a Siberian breeder in Virginia or West Virginia. And she found us this kitten. And because my wife's allergic, but some people are able to live with Siberian cats, even if they're allergic. So we got this kitten. I went down to New York, and my publisher drove down to West Virginia, drove down to Baltimore, picked up the cat, drove him up to New York. I flew down to New Jersey, stayed with my editor, Sheila Gilbert, in New Jersey, met the cat, did all the New York stuff, met my agent and all that stuff, and then flew back with the cat. So he's got a pretty substantial publishing history himself.
He does. Does he get appropriate compensation for that?
Well, his picture's on every book that Shadowpaw Press publishes. He's my logo, so I think that.
Aw.
Otherwise, he doesn't seem to care much, but.
Right. long as there's food.
Yeah. Food and laps.
Well, we could talk about the cat, but we should probably talk about the book. So the series is, it's your Worldshapers series. This is the third book. Can you give an overview of the series itself?
Sure. Worldshapers, the premise of Worldshapers is that there is this interdimensional, I don't know, use whatever word you want, this labyrinth of shaped worlds, and that people from our world, there are certain people from our world who have the ability, if they go into this labyrinth, they can take a blank space, basically, and turn it into a world of their imagination. It's about a bit like authors living inside the books that they've created. They all come from our world originally, and they all went to this school run by a mysterious woman named Agraire, who we find out in the first book is actually an alien. And we don't really know why it's not established exactly why she's putting people into the labyrinth to shape worlds, but she does. So in the first book, we meet my main character, who is Shauna Keyes, and she doesn't know that she's the shaper of the world she's living in. She's forgotten all about the first world and the school and Agraire and all of that. She just thinks she lives in the world, and she has a pretty nice life going. She's got a nice boyfriend, and she's about to open a pottery studio. She's a potter. And then there's this terrible attack, and her best friend is killed in what appears to be a terrorist attack. And the leader of this attack touches Shauna and then points a gun at her, is going to kill her. And she says, this can't be happening. This isn't happening. And just like that, it isn't happening. Not only that, but it never did happen. It's like 3 hours earlier, none of that ever happened. She's the only one that remembers it. She's also the only one who remembers her best friend, who's now vanished from the world, and nobody even remembers her having existed. So this sets off alarm bells. And then this mysterious stranger, Carl Yatzer, who she's seen previously, shows up and kind of explains that she's the shaper of this world. He thinks she's shown the power that through resetting time, that she has the power to, if she comes with him to other worlds within the labyrinth, she can gather the knowledge of the making of these worlds and get all of that to Agraire, who's hiding out somewhere else in the labyrinth. Because Agraire was attacked, the school was attacked, and there's this adversary who's trying to move from world to world, working his way toward Agraire, and wants to destroy all of the labyrinth, taking over the worlds one at a time, and eventually destroying the labyrinth and all the worlds, all the shapers, and all the billions of people who live in these worlds. So that's the basic premise. And in the first book, Carl and Shauna chased across her version of our world, which is very much like our world with a few differences, like lacrosse is the big professional sport, and the Da Vinci Code was a musical on Broadway, little things like that. And then spoiler, she does... That's one of my favorite jokes, actually.
Yeah.
In there. Hugh Jackman did his best, but he just couldn't save it. And then the second one, The Master of the World, which came out last year, which is probably what we talked about in the last interview. She finds her way into a world that was shaped by somebody who really loves Jules Verne. So it's all full of weird airships and submarines and floating islands and strange weapons and all that good, solid, steampunky stuff from Jules Verne's novels. And then the third one, the one that just came out, The Moonlit World, is best summed up by the phrase that kept running through my head when I was writing it, which was werewolves and vampires and peasants. Oh my. Because it's a world where the moon always shines. The full moon hangs in the sky. It doesn't move constantly. And it's a world inhabited by werewolves and vampires and peasants. And they have to find the shaper of this world. And without getting turned into an undead creature of the night or a lycanthrope. So those are the challenges they face in this book.
Okay, so now that you've got a bit of an idea of what's going on in this Worldshapers series. I was going to say Worldshapers World, but there's more than one world. So the Worldshapers series. Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. And when we come back, more with Edward Willett. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Edward Willett about his third book in the Worldshapers series. This one is called The Moonlit World. He just gave an overview of the series, and as I'm about to say, I am always impressed when people can describe books like this coherently, and stay tuned to find out why that impresses me.
You did a very good job of explaining the series as a whole. I love listening to and also trying to explain science fiction or fantasy books, because they always sound so crazy when you just try to describe them briefly. They always make perfect sense when you read them, but when you first try to describe it, it's like, wait, what? There's a what?
And if you're the author, you have to think, what do I put in? What do I leave out? Because obviously I have all the details, and it's easy to get bogged down and start saying, well, that's not quite right. It's really more like this, and this, but it's sort of like that. And I've tried to boil it down pretty good.
Yes. So this one is, you said the phrase vampires and werewolves and peasants, maybe I got that mixed up, oh my, but those three things, oh my, running through your head. Was that your initial inspiration, or did that just start running through your head after you started writing?
Way back when I first came up with the concept for this series, I always wanted to do a kind of a gothic world with werewolves and vampires and that sort of thing. And so this one has been in the back of my head right from before I even started writing the series, back when the series concept was completely different, because the original concept, Shauna's always been a potter, but she wasn't named Shauna. And instead of living in a world, she lived in like this long valley and in a pleasant little village, and it was much more of a fantasy setting, and all these different worlds opened out through caves in the side of this valley. That was the original concept, and it's changed considerably since then, but I always knew that I was going to do a werewolf vampire world pretty early on. I just love werewolves and vampires. It was my chance to write about them.
Right, exactly. And they've definitely been very popular in books and movies lately, for a while now. What about Shauna do you think is going to resonate with readers if they first, what will resonate with readers who maybe haven't started the series? And then following up, how do you think she continues to resonate with readers as they travel through the series with her?
I hope that people find Shauna a pleasant companion. Werewolves, vampires, all this stuff could sound a little grim, and there's certainly lots of, grim and terrifying things that happen in the books, because, they're adventure stories. But Shauna is, I hope, funny. She has my sense of humor, oddly enough, and she's because her world is only 10 years out of sync with ours. She knows everything up until 10 years ago, pop culture and so forth. She makes Star Wars jokes and Star Trek jokes, and she knows about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and she at least read some Jules Verne, and so she's kind of plugged into the same source material that the shapers of all these worlds are plugged into, and that gives me an opportunity to make jokes and she's also a musical theater fan, so that gives me a chance to do the Da Vinci Code, the musical joke. And there was a joke in Master of the World about one of the characters who kind of had a theatrical background within that world just couldn't believe that anything such as Cats, the musical, actually existed. So I get to make all those kinds of jokes. And I think that makes Shauna somebody that will stick in people's heads as somebody who's pleasant to spend time with. And I guess the other thing I hope is that Shauna is resourceful. She manages to get through the most tremendous situations and come out the other side and accomplish what she needs to accomplish, with a lot of self-doubt along the way and things like that. But I think she's a strong and interesting character, and I hope that's what resonates with people.
Yeah, and I like her because, she has forgotten that she is a shaper. So she is, in a lot of ways, she's not a normal human because she is a shaper, but in a lot of ways she is a normal human because she is just trying to figure this out as she goes along. And, she has to find the resources within herself. She's not a superhero. She's not Buffy the Vampire Slayer. She's just kind of a regular person who is trying to figure out all these different worlds, and that's one thing that I really like about her.
Yeah, she, in a way, you know, in the first world, once she discovers she's the Shaper, she has some ability to literally shape the world around her and change people and things like that. In the second book, because she doesn't have any ability to shape a world until she finds the Shaper and takes their Chokmah, it's called, which is a Hebrew word meaning wisdom, until she takes that knowledge of the shaping of the world, she's just an ordinary person doing her best, trying to get to where she can make that happen. But until that happens, she has no special powers in whatever world she finds herself in. And I think that makes her interesting as well.
I would agree. She is accompanied by Carl, who is introduced in the first book. They are together most of the time, but separated some of the time. So how is that relationship evolving as the series goes on?
Well, when Carl first shows up, she thinks of him as like her all-knowing guide. He's the only one that knows what's going on. She doesn't have a clue. As time goes along, for most of the second book, Master of the World, Carl is stuck in her world, and she's on her own entirely. And so by the time he shows up, she's navigated her way through this. There's still stuff she doesn't know that he knows it, that she starts to find out. Then in this third book, in the Moonlit World, she starts to get more ability herself. And so the big change in the Moonlit World, I think, is that instead of just being not exactly the hanger-on, but kind of she has to follow where he leads. She actually becomes the leader and the powerful force that decides where they go next by the end of this book. And so that's kind of their changing relationship. There's no romantic relationship between these two at all. He's quite a bit older than she is, and he is in love. He's only ever been in love with one woman, and he's quite faithful to that memory. So there's no romantic relationship between them at all, which I think is also kind of nice in a book where you have a male and a female character, and that's just not part of their. It's a bit like the Doctor, Sometimes his companions get kind of fall in love with him, but that's never going to happen. the other direction. Closest we ever got was with Rose, I guess. But yeah, I think that's kind of interesting. But that relationship is evolving, and Carl and her goals are not necessarily always going to be the same, and we get a little hint of that in the Moonlit World. That there's something she does toward the end of the book that kind of alarms him as to how she's developing. So there's some interesting things going on there.
Right. Well, and they come at it from different perspectives because he has been given this quest. I guess you could call it a quest, but by Agraire, and so he has a specific goal in mind, and he has his reasons for wanting to complete this journey and make sure that the worlds are restored, whereas Shauna was kind of thrown into it as being a powerful shaper, and so they definitely come at it from different perspectives. Yeah,
and there's different goals for sure, and Carl and Shauna knows this, that Carl has said, well, if anything happens to you, that would be terrible, but I'll just have to find another shaper who can do it. So that puts a little tension there too. Yeah, Carl is a viewpoint character. That's one of the interesting things about writing the book, is that it's mostly in first person from Shauna's viewpoint, but both the adversary and Carl get their own occasionally. The adversary hardly appears in this book, but Carl's sections then are written in third person and hers are written in first person, and I find that interesting to do as a writer, and I hope it's interesting for readers.
Yeah, it definitely gives you a bit of a different perspective, and you get to see, obviously, when Carl's separated from Shauna, then you see what he's doing, but even when they're together, then you see things from his perspective, which is nice. You have mentioned, you've mentioned the Doctor. We've mentioned Buffy, Star Trek, Star Wars. The books are littered with pop culture references, which is fun. Is that how your brain works? You said Shauna has your sense of humor, but is that just the way your brain is going all the time? Or do you kind of work at putting that into the book?
Pretty much. I don't have to work very hard at that at all. No, when a joke occurs to me, or a pop culture reference occurs to me, Shauna knows it. And, I freely admit that for her supposed age, she's 27 and when the first book starts, Some of her references are perhaps a little older, but on the other hand, in this modern age, I mean, my daughter who's 19 gets, everything is available everywhere, right? So people can discover what might seem like an old pop culture reference, but it's not really old because it's on the internet somewhere. So I don't have to work at those. That's just the way my brain works. And this is the first book I've written where I can really indulge in that.
Yeah, well, it makes me laugh. So I mean, I think I get most of them, 90% of them. Maybe there's a couple that I'm like, not sure what that one was, but I can't think of any of those. So maybe I get all of them. I don't know. Maybe my brain is just as pop culture-y as yours.
You're my ideal reader then.
Wonderful. Did you do any kinds of research for this book?
Actually, not much for this one. Here and there's little things that pop up, like there's a reference to Bishop Ussher's The History of the World that set the date for the creation of the world. I think it was a Wednesday in October in 4004 BC. He pinned it down to like the exact time. And I looked that up. I was aware of the book and that date, but I needed to get a little more detail. So stuff like that occasionally will pop up. But as far as the vampires and werewolves, I felt no need whatsoever to do any research on those, because the whole setup of these worlds is that the Shapers can make things however they want. So I do play with the fact that, I think there's some reference to, do they cast, can you see their reflection and things like that? And I'll play with some of those ideas a bit. But if something doesn't match up what Shauna thinks a vampire, werewolf, how they should work, doesn't matter, because that's just the way that the Shaper of this world decided to make them work. So this one didn't take much research. Master of the World I did a bit more because it was so much based on Jules Verne. And while I'd read sort of the big ones, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Mysterious Island and so forth, I certainly hadn't read all of Verne. And so I did some digging into some of his books and his descriptions of airships and things like that, and in his character names, because almost every secondary character or minor character in Master of the World is actually from a Jules Verne book. It has nothing to do with their character in the book. I just took their name and gave it to a character in that world. So I had fun with that sort of thing. But yeah, this was not a particularly research-heavy one.
Time for our second break of the podcast, so stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Just as a reminder, before the break, I asked about research. So Edward was talking about the different types of research he might do for each book. But of course, each book, as I said at the beginning, it takes place on a world that has been shaped. And so the laws of what we might understand for the references might not be the same in each world. So let's go ahead and get back to the interview with Edward.
Yeah, and that's nice, because if you because you can play with it. Like you said, the last world was Jules Verne. This world is vampires and werewolves, but each world is based on something that the shaper wants it to be based on, but they also have the ability to then, change the lore or alter things so that they, I don't know if they make more sense, maybe to the shaper, maybe not, but to how they
just to make the world work.
Yeah.
I mean, because in this case, the vampires and the werewolves and the peasants are all supposed to be living happily ever after through something called the Pact, which is my other favorite joke, because the Pact was set up by Abbot Nathan Costello, as this werewolf and vampire troupe was there. And, so that's Abbot and Costello meets the werewolves and the vampires. So that's my favorite joke in this book. But that was just something that doesn't come from anywhere except for the needs of both my story, but also the needs of the world that was created here. Because the original idea of the creators of this world was it was going to be just a nice place where vampires and werewolves and peasants all hung out together. And then something has gone wrong, as we discover through the course of the book.
Did you write this book just so you could use that joke?
No, that joke did not even occur to me until I was writing the scene. I was writing about the backstory, and I suddenly realized, wait, it's a church. There could be an abbot. This is a werewolf. This is a vampire. Oh, I know the abbot's name. It was literally on the moment I got to that point in the writing that it came to me.
That's fabulous. What can you tell us about book 4? Where are we going next?
Well, book 4 is a bit up in the air. I don't know for sure if it will come out from DAW, but I do hope to write it, so it might be coming out from my own publishing company. Book 4 is set up at the end of this book. It doesn't have a title yet, but it will be in a film noir kind of world, and it's all plotted out. I know what happens in it, so if I just sit down and start writing it, I can make it happen. So it's kind of a film noir world. There's I think Humphrey Bogart and the Maltese Falcon and maybe some Jimmy Cagney thrown in there. And it might, I haven't decided yet, but it might literally be a black and white world where everything in the world is seen in black and white. I'm playing with that. I think that could be fun. It'd be an interesting writing challenge not to use any color words to describe things.
Yeah, there's so many possibilities where not only with the black and white, but also just with film noir, and again, lots more pop culture references.
I do want to finish the series, whether DAW continues it or not, because I do know how it ends, and I think it's open-ended, so it could conceivably go on for book after book after book. But at the same time, I do know what the end is, and I could conceivably wrap it up in about 3 more books. So whatever happens with DAW on publishing it, I hope I will actually finish the series.
Well, that's good, because I was actually just thinking about that this morning. I was thinking, this book really could go on indefinitely, because there are, that many worlds that they could go through. But I was very much hoping that it would not go on for the next, 30 years. So I'd like some closure at some point, please.
Yeah, if it ends up coming.
King.
If it ends up and I'm publishing it or I'm finding a different publisher, either way, I suspect I will wrap it up. Partly because things have changed dramatically enough in what Shauna can do and so forth in this book that I'm actually getting very close to the point where I can just push it through to the end game with the Greer and the adversary and everything. So I would think I would need at least 3 more books, but I'm not pinning myself down.
All right, sounds good. So in addition to writing this series and writing other books as well, you also have a podcast. Do you want to talk about that podcast a little bit?
Yes, that's the Worldshapers podcast. That's the worldshapers.com. Oddly enough, it has the same title, almost the same name as my series, because they started at exactly the same time. I'm a journalist by training. I was a newspaper reporter for years, and I've hosted TV and radio programs, and I always thought, I could do a fine podcast. Once podcast started, it took me years to get around to actually doing it, and this was kind of the impetus, this tie-in with the launch of the series. And I've always loved at conventions and places like that talking to other authors about the nuts and bolts of writing, the creative process. So I decided, well, what if I did that? And I do have connections in the field now. I've met a lot of people, and so I reached out to some big name authors to start with. John Scalzi and Robert J. Sawyer, Tanya Huff, and Julie Cherneda were my first 4 authors. And the podcast is up to episodes as of this week. In fact, I'm doing one today. It will be 65, 66, I think. I talk to authors for an hour about their creative process. We talk about usually focusing on a particular book as an example. Talk about how they got started writing and interested in writing and all of that. And then we go through the process from idea creation to planning, outlining, writing process, revision, editing. And then at the end, I'll ask the big philosophical questions. I always do that with my voice. I'm going to put reverb on it one of these days. The big philosophical questions, which are, why do you write? Which is always interesting to hear what people have to say. Or why do you think anybody writes? And it's been going very well. I've had amazing guests, David Brin, Tad Williams, David Weber, Joe Haldeman, Shannon McGuire. I've just talked to Cory Doctorow, James Morrow. I've got F. Paul Wilson, or recent interviews that haven't even aired yet, but I've done. So yeah, people have been very generous with their time, and I've been thrilled to have an opportunity to talk to all these wonderful people.
And it has actually created, out of those guests, you have actually now created Shapers of World, which is a collection of short stories from authors who have been guests on that podcast. So do you want to talk a little bit about Shapers of World?
Yeah, that was because of the Shadow Paw Press, which we talked about. I'm a member of Sask Books, which is the Association of Saskatchewan Publishers. And at our annual meeting last year, there was a publisher from Winnipeg came in and did a presentation on kickstarting, and she'd successfully kickstarted an anthology. And I was listening to that, and I thought, hey, I know some authors. So it took me a while, again, to, because I'd never done a Kickstarter, and that was a little daunting. And, I'm busy with other stuff, too. But I reached out to my first-year guests. I had to cut it off somewhere, and asked them how many would be interested in either writing original fiction or offering a reprint. And I ended up with brand new stories from Shannon McGuire, Tanya Huff, David Weber, L.D. Modisett Jr., D.J. Butler, Christopher Rocchio, John C. Wright, Shelley Adina, and some guy named Edward Willett. Because I was actually a guest on my own podcast. I interviewed myself with one of my pseudonyms, interviewed me. And then there's reprints from John Scalzi, David Brin, Joe Haldeman, Julie E. Cherneda, Fonda Lee, Dr. Charles E. Gannon, Gareth L. Powell, Derek Kunsken, and Thorea Dyer. And the Kickstarter went off in March. Great timing. But it worked, and it funded, and it just went out. The print copies went out to backers about a month ago. The ebook copies are out, and various other rewards. And it's now available as an ebook everywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever it is you like to buy ebooks, it's available, as well as through shadowpawpress.com. You can download it directly from there, which is great if you'd like to do that, because I make more money that way. And the print version, the commercial print version, is in the works. It's being printed, and I have a distributor for that, and I believe it goes out officially November 17th is the release date. So yeah, I'm very excited about it, and I'm very pleased. It's an interesting mixture, because a lot of anthologies have a theme, and the only theme here is, here's a showcase of some authors. So there's science fiction, there's fantasy, there's creepy little stories, there's fun stories, there's all kinds of different stories. So you'll find, everyone should find something for them within this anthology.
That is very cool. Do you think you would do something like this again?
I've already reached out to my second-year guests, and a lot of them are coming. Oh, sure. So we've got people like Barbara Hambley and Kelly Armstrong, Tim Pratt, S.M. Sterling, people of that level who have already said, sure, either they might be able to offer an original story or a reprint. So I suspect there's another Kickstarter in my future along about February or March.
Well, I hope next year...
Shapers of Worlds Volume 2.
Yeah. Hopefully next year will not be another 2020, but hopefully the process
that would be
will
nice.
go as well. So you are clearly plenty busy with everything. Are you working on anything specific now? I know you said you have book 4 in your head, but are you working on writing anything else?
Well, my next contract with DAW is actually for a completely different project. It'll be a big, sprawling space opera called The Tangled Stars. So that's sold, and it's due in March, so I should probably be getting on that right about now.
Yeah.
And it's going to be about 150,000 words, so it'll be my longest. Well, I wrote that much for Magebane, which I wrote under one of my pseudonyms, Lee Arthur Chain. It was about 150,000 words, so this will be one of my longest books. So I'm very excited about that. I love writing. Like, these are kind of the Worldshapers books have a science fiction backstory. All of this stuff goes back to aliens, but it reads like a portal fantasy. So they're usually called fantasies. But it'll be fun to do just a proper, flat-out spaceships and wormholes and things, kind of a science fiction epic. I'm looking forward to that.
Sounds very fun. What have you, in all of your spare time, it sounds like you have so much, but what have you been reading since we talked last?
I tend to read parts of the books of the people that I'm interviewing on the podcast. I don't always get them read completely. So
I hear you.
that takes up a lot of my time. But I'm currently reading, I've already interviewed James Morrow, but I am currently reading his book, The Last Witchfinder. And, so I read ones I've read to completion. That's one I'm reading to completion. There's a book by Edward Savio called Alexander X, a YA book, which I read recently. Read a lot of nonfiction. My wife and I our kitchen does not lend itself to both of us cooking side by side at the same time. So we've gotten into the habit of, while she cooks, I read out loud. So we've read things like Matt Ridley's book about innovation we read recently. We read all of Hamilton, the huge, massive biography that the musical came out of. We read all that out loud. So yeah, it's just an eclectic mixture of stuff. Oh, I guess the one thing I have made sure I get is the latest Jim Butcher Dresden Files book. So I never miss one of those, or a David Weber book. I never miss those.
Thank you. Okay, so you've mentioned the website for the podcast. How about your author website and where people can connect with you on social media?
My author website is edwardwillett.com. Make sure there are 2 T's on Willett, Willett. There's also my publishing thing, which I mentioned, shadowpawpress.com. People who would like to buy autographed books from me, you can buy those and also download some ebooks from edwardwillettshop.com. That's my online store. So those are my 3 major websites. If you want to look at one of my pseudonyms, there's also ecblake.com, has his own website. And my YA series, Shards of Excalibur, which I just put out in new ebooks from Shadowpaw Press, has its own website, shardsofexcalibur.com. Yeah, so sometimes if you go to one of my websites and it seems a little behind, it's probably because I forgot I had it, because I've got so many websites. My social media is on Twitter, I'm at eWillett, and the Worldshapers is at the Worldshapers, and Shadowpaw Press is at Shadowpaw Press. On Facebook, I'm at edward.willett, and you can also find the Worldshapers on there, at the Worldshapers, and Shadowpaw Press at Shadowpaw Press. And what else? I am on Instagram, but I'm not very good at it. But you can find me at Edward Willett Author on Instagram.
Thank you so much for that. We have talked about a variety of things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you were wanting to mention in terms of the series or your other books or the podcast, anything at all that we haven't covered?
Well, I do just want to mention the Shards of Excalibur that I just mentioned in passing. This is a series, 5-book series, YA. It's about a girl from right here in Regina who discovers she has the power of the Lady of the Lake. Lady of the Lake shows up in Wascana Lake, which is about 3 blocks from my house. Because why not? Everybody's got to be somewhere. And it tells her that she has the power of the Lady of the Lake, and that she and this boy have to find the scattered shards of Excalibur before Merlin can. He's the bad guy in the series, in his modern-day guise as Rex Majors, like a Bill Gates, Steve Jobs kind of computer magnet guy. So that's the premise, and it was published by a local company called Kato Books, very respected literary publisher, who went out of business, went bankrupt this year. And so I got the rights back, and I've now put out all the books out again in ebook through Shadowpaw Press. You can find them on everywhere you can buy ebooks. The first one is Song of the Sword, and I think they're a good series. Song of the Sword was longlisted for the Sunburst Award for Canadian speculative fiction writing, one of the major Canadian awards, and the second book, Twist of the Blade, was shortlisted for the Aurora Award for Best YA Novel, and the last book in the series, Door into Fairy, was also shortlisted for Best YA Novel for an Aurora. So I think they're a good series, and I would just there's also great audiobooks narrated by Elizabeth Klatt, so I would really like people to find those. So that's the other thing I would like to mention, and I guess I just did.
Yes, you did. Speaking of audiobooks, one more. Will there be an audiobook of The Moonlit World, and do you have an idea on when that might be out?
I don't know. They was not picked up by the company that did the first two books, each of which had a different narrator, which was interesting as well. So at the moment, there are no plans for an audiobook for The Moonlit World. But again, it's possible that I might something could happen there. I just don't know. There are some things happening with. I'm working on a package with the Moonlit World. Like I'm hoping to do a series Bible and all that sort of stuff, and see about pitching it to some movie types, TV types. I have no idea. Of course, mostly nothing ever happens with that kind of stuff. But so, and an audiobook might fall in there somewhere. I don't know. But at the moment, there's no plans.
Okay.
I could do it myself if I got the rights back, but I don't think I'm the right voice for it.
Maybe for Carl.
Yeah.
Well, Edward, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. I know you have your own podcast to record later, so thank you so much for joining me and talking about the podcast and the series and the new book, The Moonlit World.
Well, thanks so much for having me on again. I enjoyed it, and maybe I'll talk to you again in another year or so.
I hope so. That would be wonderful.
Once again, thank you to Edward for joining me for the second time on this podcast to talk about the Moonlit World. I enjoy this series, and I'm excited to see where it goes and what worlds are coming up. My dad also read he just read all three of them in the last month or so, and so we've been talking about them, and he called me the other day and asked the question that I asked Edward of, so if there are infinite numbers of worlds, how long is this series going to last? And so I said, I asked Edward that exact question. You'll have to listen to the interview. So I got to pass this link on to my dad so he can hear Edward's answer on that question. Thank you, Edward, for joining me. Thank you, listeners, as always, for being the wonderful book lovers that you are. I hope you will join me again for the next episode when I have another returning author. Jim Nelson has been on the podcast before talking about his Bridge Daughter series. This time he will be talking a little bit more about that series as well as his new cyber noir thriller. It's called In My Memory Locked. It's a little bit futuristic, not too far in the future, and it's intrigue and well, obviously it's a thriller, cyber noir. I mean, that tells you a lot, right? You know, there's going to be some intrigue, some mystery, some futuristic stuff, and some intensity because it's a thriller. So join me for that again. That's Jim Nelson. His book is called In My Memory Locked. I hope you're having a wonderful week. I hope that if you are behind, you're getting caught up like I am, or that you just never got behind in the first place. That would be better. But thank you so much for joining me, and join me again next time. But in the meantime, I hope you have plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts podcast. Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.